share some images and some of the kind of materials that I examine in the book and kind of talk with you about them to try to think about this relationship, in particular between racial subordination and democracy. And so I think that's kind of how it'll unfold. And I'm certainly not a theorist of democracy by any means, but I was really intrigued by this notion of trying to figure out how democracy operates in a lived, embedded settings. And I do hope that there's some engagement with that here. So let me just first start out to give you a little kind of overview about some of what I'll be talking about and some of what's in the book. So in the 1990s, in a really, really short span of years, California, which has a long history of using the ballot measures in all kinds of ways, confronted a series of measures. 1994, 3 strikes and you're out, which was a repeat sentencing measure, inaugurated what many call to be really the largest prison building project in human history. This is a time when California built more than a dozen state prisons and not a single UC over 20 years. The same year passed, considered Proposition 187, which made one's immigration status a condition to deny a whole range of public benefits. It actually made every UC, CSU, and community college student would have to line up every term and document their lawful presence to the registrar before they could enroll. And if you couldn't do that, your name would be turned over to the INS. And every California public employee was required by law under this measure to turn in anyone they suspected of being in violation of immigration laws. 1996, California became the first state to consider a total ban on public affirmative action programs. 1998, a measure to largely eliminate bilingual education programs in the state and impose essentially one approach for educating English language learners. And in 2000, a criminal sentencing measure targeting youth that would try youth as young as 16 as adults and increase the role of the adult correction system in being applied to youth. All of these passed. They passed by wide majorities, and they passed at a time when even Democrats hold a very, very large electoral margin in California politics. And at the time when other seemingly liberal initiatives, the legalization of medical marijuana, a minimum wage initiative, the rejection of school vouchers passed. This is not simply just kind of illiberal electorate. It's indeed a deeply liberal electorate that passes these. And as I was active as a community organizer in the 1990s, so that's part of what I was trying to figure out through this project is how did it come to be that kind of sunny, diverse, and golden California was setting really a national leadership role in passing initiatives like this. And as I got more into the project, I kind of came to understand that there was a real important precedent for this. So for example, and I'll talk a little about some of these this afternoon, in 1946, right after World War II, it was still absolutely legal for unions to have Jim Crow locals. So one local for white members and another local for non-white members, and absolutely legal and in fact quite prevalent to be able to put an ad in the newspaper saying, help wanted gas station attendant, white genteel applicants only. So early civil rights activists in California put an initiative on the ballot to make that illegal, to set up a state commission that would be empowered to investigate that. In 1964, realtors put on the ballot a measure that would make racial discrimination in housing a constitutionally protected practice. So I could very easily say, I will not sell my home to you because you're Jewish, and it would be written into the Constitution that it was perfectly legal. In 1972 and 79, Californians considered measures to reverse court-ordered school desegregation. California had among the most segregated schools in the country. Court said this is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, and 2 measures qualified to essentially make those measures no longer apply to schools. And in 84 and 86, voted on ballot measures in 84 to put California on the record against multilingual ballots. In 1986, a measure to declare English the official language of the state. Again, this is at a time, since the New Deal, Democrats have had a large registration advantage. This is the kind of California's booming sunny years. And every one of these measures passes by a large margin. The only one that fails is the Fair Employment Pro-Civil Rights measure, and that fails 70 to 30%. So together, I think this history asks us to kind of consider, and this is what I kind of explore in the book, a number of questions that relate to levels of racial subordination in contemporary California. So just as one, just to kind of puts a kind of baseline out there, if we consider the number today of African Americans enrolled as graduates, undergraduate, or professional students in the UC system versus in the California state prisons, and this is not even county jails or probation and parole. So that for every one African American in the UC system, as of 2008, we have 6 in our state prisons. The vast majority, we have to always remind ourselves, for nonviolent offenses, property offenses, drug offenses as well. Okay, and it's obviously directly related to this history. Another way we might think about it, or kind of point into this, these kind of conditions, is to think about youth organizing groups in places like East Los Angeles that have really been on the cutting edge of trying to push school reform and educational adequacy. And they talk about the disappeared students in their school. So consider Roosevelt High School in East Los Angeles, where you might start an entering 9th grade class. Let's just take 30 students here who might enter together in 9th grade. 4 years later, and this is about average, there's certainly schools actually that have a worse ratio than this, that roughly, I think in a good year, about a third will graduate. And the word they use, the others, is disappeared. Sometimes the district just doesn't know what happens to them, but rather than drop out, they emphasize either pushed out or disappeared. Even fewer of the graduates have simply taken the UC and CSU courses, or high school courses that make them eligible to apply to a UC or CSU among the graduates, and the number that would attend a 4-year college. And certainly, unless we subscribe to the kind of most deeply stigmatizing and racist notions of cultural inferiority, we have to ask what kinds of conditions lead this to be the baseline in our schools today. We could talk about lots of other measures of racial disparities and healthcare and women's rights, LGBT rights, etc. So part of what I want to do then is think about what is this connection between racial subordination in its historic and current forms and direct democracy, the notion of kind of the populace collectively participating in making laws, kind of how we can work together. And I might ask us to think, or I might just put out 3 kind of questions to think about here, or that I'm trying to think about. What is the political subjectivity produced by democratic practices, which is in all ballot measures, if you'll see them, the kind of advertised debates, there's always a we. This is what we need, our state, this kind of possessive notion of us, the people. And partly what I want to ask is, what kinds of racial subjects has direct democracy in California produced? In other words, when we say, save our state, who is that our that we're referring to? Part of the argument I make is that our actually doesn't exist fully prior to the initiative, that the initiative produces that we. Okay? And finally, I use this notion that I'll talk about a couple of times of political whiteness, which I describe as a political subjectivity, a way of looking at politics that's conditioned by the expectations of whiteness. It doesn't mean the political expectations of people who identify as white. It means what role whiteness plays in shaping how we see, interpret, and recognize politics. So those things I'd like you to keep in mind. So let me just start, and I'm just going to take a couple of historic examples as I move through. So this is a flyer from 1945. So the war, July 4th, 1945. The war is not quite over. It's an Interdependence Day celebration to promote racial friendliness in America. So 15,000 people fill the Hollywood Bowl. The mayor is there, a Supreme Court justice, local labor leaders. Kind of this notion that the kind of freedoms that the fighting for the war represented needed to be brought to bear on U.S. democracy. So this is a picture of the Hollywood Bowl then. And then when I came across this, this is kind of remarkable in the mid-1940s to have I wonder actually if there was a celebration of racial friendliness today with 15,000 people stream into the Hollywood Bowl on 4th of July. And at the time, there's interesting contradictions that are at work there. So, for example, in 1945 in California, this is a picture of a class of Latino students, Mexican-American students in Orange County. The segregation of Mexican-American students was still perfectly legal. It was the practice in Orange County that Mexican-American students would be segregated. You could still find minstrel shows in California that school districts, Elks Lodges, Lions Clubs performed. One of the first things after the war the NAACP did was we've got to stop the use of minstrel shows in California. You'd still find interracial marriage is still against the law at this time in California. You'd find pools that would only allow Black and Latino Mexican-American patrons 1 day a week and then would drain the pool afterwards. There was still segregation on railroad cars in the state. And until 1942, you could read in the LA Times a weekly column on eugenics. My alma mater, USC, was a leading center of thought on eugenics. So that's this kind of interesting contradiction is how we think about these things together. On the one hand, some kind of political determination to no longer make race the basis of subordination. And on the other hand, and I think, my sense is when most of these folks streamed in, they weren't, their mind wasn't actually on things like the segregation of Mexican-American students. It was on what was happening in the South. That was viewed as the kind of epicenter of racial subordination. So kind of what happened when those ideas are brought to bear on actually existing practices in California. And so this is in 1944, by 1945, Los Angeles alone had 12 what they called kind of home front unity groups, interracial solidarity committees. In the state of California, there were 150 within a couple of years. And the idea was generally, we could take the lofty ideals that motivated the war against fascism and bring them home to bear. That Americanism would be the kind of main political strategy to renounce things like the internment of Japanese Americans, which had just happened a few years earlier. This was going to be the kind of framework that helped accomplish this politically. And the first kind of applied place it was brought to bear was in a fair employment ballot measure in 1946. So this is Representative Augustus Hawkins. He's the second African American elected to the California State Assembly. And he says, fair employment has to be the place. This is it's a kind of wartime conversion. We have to have access now to the jobs in post-war California. So he helps lead this effort to qualify this petition on the ballot. And he's very clear. He said Californians are fair-minded. California more than any state is transformed by the war. They'll understand. We fought for democracy abroad. We need it at home. So he, built this kind of fairly remarkable interracial coalition. So you have Jewish groups, other kind of immigrant groups, Mexican-American groups, Asian-American groups, standing on the street corner, gathering. This is before the day of kind of paid signature gatherers. So kind of everyday folks standing on the corner in LA, Oakland, and San Francisco, collecting signatures to try to get this on the ballot. And with a deep conviction that the democracy would in fact be a resource for them. They qualify. It's the first time anything like this appears on the California ballot. Kind of rhetorically, they're trying to mobilize all these notions. Look, we did write abroad. This is the double victory against fascism abroad and kind of racism at home. So fair employment practices, the ABCs of Americanism, that only kind of unapologetic bigot would stand in the way of this. That was absolutely their assumption. And what they found, actually, the coalition that emerged to organize against them called themselves the Committee for Tolerance. They didn't call them, they weren't kind of a subset of, 20 years earlier, you could have very easily found, California had a long set of isolationists who didn't want the state to go into the war. The Ku Klux Klan held massive rallies in places like Long Beach 20 years earlier. But this isn't who came out against them. They recognize that the times have changed. They call themselves the Committee for Tolerance. And what they say is this measure actually promotes race prejudice. Why does it promote race prejudice? Because it forces people who will inevitably be in conflict to work side by side. And it's a case of the state taking private prerogatives away. It's definitely pitched at white workers where it said your rights are going to be in danger. The state can tell you that you'll have to work next to whomever. Prejudice is a bad thing, but you have to give people time to address it on their own. And it's the Chamber of Commerce largely that kind of stands behind this because they have some vested interest in being able to use race to assign workers. And it fails by a huge, huge margin. And I think the civil rights groups are stunned at that moment to think about how these contradictions might be able to be sustained. And it's the last time, actually, the civil rights groups think that the ballot is a place where these ideas are going to get some support. There's something to think about just quickly in the aftermath of this. At the time, this shows a shift change of a massive Lockheed airplane in the 1940s. I think white workers in particular thought, we're not the ones that are at risk of losing jobs, that's someone else. This doesn't affect our reality, so it's just in my interest to vote against this. It prevents them then from seeing over the next 20 years these dramatic changes that are happening in the California economy, that they soon would also become vulnerable to limits on full employment. So that some 40 years later, when the last, there used to be a thriving auto center, center of automobile production in California, when their last jobs are taken away, they have no sense of the need to organize more broadly. So that's the kind of first episode that I want to talk about this kind of connection between racial subordination and direct democracy. The second I want to mention now, to move ahead, is in housing. California was really at the forefront of legalizing racially restrictive covenants. So this is, in every housing, there's a deed that says, that applies not to the owner, but to the house itself. It says, you can't raise pigs here, and you can't build 3 other houses on the lot. And California was the first state to put into these deeds that the house, regardless of who owns it, shall not be occupied by someone who's not a measure of the Caucasian race. Now, it's California courts in the 20s that first validate and uphold these measures. They're certainly, they're in Seattle, they're in Portland, they're in Chicago, and St. Louis. But Los Angeles, by one estimate, 70% of the housing stock is covered by restrictive covenants by the 1940s. Realtors are the primary purveyors of these restrictions. It's part of their profit-making strategy. Real estate is more valuable if it's divided. If you can sell a house for more, if you can argue that it's exclusive, and race was one of the ways that it made exclusive. So this is in 1940. This is in the monthly magazine of the California Real Estate Association, in which the Southwest Realty Board, which serves kind of South LA, is proudly, it actually got an award for the work of its Race Restrictions Committee. This is a committee that would go door to door to homeowners and ask them to put a provision in their house deed saying that the house was for Caucasians only. This is Glendale in 1949 in the same magazine. Realtors, again, proudly declaring it's a 100% Caucasian risk community. Developers play an enormous role. It's actually stunning to look back and see the levels of racial segregation in places like the San Fernando Valley, where even primarily black, but even some Mexican-American engineers working in the high-tech plants were entirely funneled into one neighborhood in Pacoima. We're talking about less than 10 families in an entire decade who were documented to be able to live outside of those boundaries. So this is in Reseda and a lot. 1955, even after restrictive covenants are banned by the Supreme Court, that's advertised to, quote, coloreds only. And all of these new developments, I mean, these massive hundreds of thousands of people moving into the area, all absolutely 100% white. So you can take a place like Lakewood, which in a span of a couple of years, 17,000 new homes in what was a bean field. The lock on the American dream for what would become the baby boomer generation, the parents of baby boomers. 17,000 homes, 99% white. If you were black or especially dark-skinned Latino and you went to the Lakewood sales office, they would tell you that all the houses were available right now. This is from 1956. This is the 50s version of like Realty.com, where you can find out what a house has, and it talks about the fruit trees and the dimensions. And the interesting thing here is this is a homeowner who's leaving, so this is not. They actually do this out of kind of solidarity to their neighbors. They're saying, I'm not going to sell my house to a Mexican, and in fact, that means that they conceivably could take a lower price because race is such an integral part of how people think about housing. Okay, there's lots I won't talk about. Lots of cases of vigilante violence when the first African American, sometimes even Asian American families move into a previously segregated neighborhood. The kinds of violence they see. This is even Willie Mays in 1957, by then, you know, a star with the San Francisco Giants, unable to buy a house in San Francisco. He has to employ the assistance of a kind of human rights group to be able to do it. It's always enforced by the community. This is organizing among the realtors and homeowners, fighting for, to protect their race restrictions in the 1940s. There's always this kind of gender and class politic to it. This is against a public housing ballot measure, but this notice that we're going to have to pay for their housing. So you can see these kind of signifiers of a stable middle-class couple looking at this kind of rental housing, saying, you know, we're going to have to pay for them. There's always resistance to this. There's active organizing against racial restrictive covenants. Sit-in Richmond to integrate public housing, picketing a developer in the 60s. And it leads to California finally passing, I mean, for 15 years it had worked on this, what today we take as very common sense fair housing laws. It says that it's illegal to use race, religion, national origin as a basis to deny someone housing. That's the Rumford Fair Housing Act. It's passed in 1963. The next year, the realtors qualify a measure for the ballot. The most signatures ever turned in for a California measure in state history. It mentions nothing about race. It simply says, the state shall not deny, limit, or abridge the right of any person who is willing or desires to sell, lease, or rent any property in its absolute discretion. So the basic thing is you, the state, can't tell me what to do with my house. Right? If I want to say that women can't be in it, that's my prerogative. That's what a property right is. And so what's interesting here is the language then that the realtors and indeed California homeowners use. It's not promoting discrimination. It's not about the need for segregation. It's not even about property values. It's simply about this notion of property rights, our rights. Right? So you see all these, this is not a rejection of freedoms, rights, kind of a liberal history. It's an embracing, quoting the 14th Amendment to legitimate it. And this is key to this notion of political subjectivity. So this is a flyer for the Yes on 14 campaign. Get back our rights. Right? Now, on the one hand, there's no mention of race here. Right? It doesn't say, you know, keep our neighborhood white. But of course, the only person that would recognize that as a right would have to be white. There was no such thing as a non-white right to discriminate. So here, when we say get back your rights, that audience, that subjectivity, is always already white. It's a white right that they're being exhorted to protect. It's the right to discriminate. This is a billboard then similarly, freedom, rent or sell to whom you choose. Again, that freedom is a racially constituted freedom. You would not recognize that freedom did you not see the world through what I call political whiteness. And even these references promote friendly community relations, that this is the way we can live harmoniously. They constantly disavow. They said this has nothing to do with discrimination. Of course, we're not in Mississippi. This is the way, in fact, if you impose these laws on us, it's going to lead to turmoil. Okay? Actually, fairly massive group responded to try to organize against it. It was led by Pat Brown, the Democratic governor. And all of their notion of how you would defeat something like this is you just, again, have to appeal to people's sense of good judgment. Only a closed-minded John Birch Society member would want to support, would want to legalize the right to discriminate, put it in the state constitution. And they said, we got it, we're just going to say don't legalize hate. Right? This was the absolute thing. It was run by the kind of liberal establishment of democratic politics who said, look, you're going to have to get white voters to support this. Black voters, Latino voters, they're still a minority. We know how to talk to these moderate white voters. And one of the things they say, this is the lieutenant governor, if we now ally ourselves with the South in the civil rights struggle, in other words, if we become Mississippi, the future of the state is in serious jeopardy. California did not achieve her present wealth and importance by becoming a symbol of fear and hate. And again, you can see how whiteness kind of haunts this exhortation. Because to whom is California a symbol of kind of wealth and importance and freedom? It's certainly not to black home seekers who cannot find any housing at all. Right? So this, even here, this notion of California is not Mississippi is predicated, I argue, on political whiteness. And there's some cases, this is the Liberal California Council of Churches, so a liberal Protestant congregation, against Prop 14, saying to its members, listen, economic inequalities over our long history of discrimination make it almost impossible for minority citizens to buy homes of their choice. Which is to say, even if they get this right, none of them are going to move into our neighborhood. They don't have the money. The right of all people to acquire property does not basically result in the widespread use of that right. So you don't have to worry. You can vote for this without worrying that your neighborhood is going to change. Only a handful of people. And of those handful, they will be fine, upstanding citizens. So this is, again, I argue, predicated on political whiteness. That notion that you can, in fact, insist upon and think that the value of your neighborhood and home derives from racial segregation is legitimate. And both sides are affirming. So this is the paradox then of Proposition 14. California in 1964, like most of the rest of the country, overwhelmingly votes to elect the pro-civil rights Lyndon Johnson over the anti-civil rights Goldwater, in an absolute landslide. And Johnson, who just signs the Civil Rights Act, Goldwater, who comes out against it. And at the same time, overwhelmingly votes to make racial discrimination in housing a constitutionally protected practice. After Proposition 14, that notion that there could be a militancy to say, actually, segregation housing should not be the baseline, withers away. And what happens again, instead, is in its place, it adjusts to the expectations of political whiteness. So rather than saying we have structural, historic problems, maintaining these levels of inequality, it becomes, I'll find a house for you, and a house for you, and a house for you. Because any larger scale demand would upset those expectations. So even in the 1970s, when Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is at UCLA, he has to go through one of these fair housing groups to find housing in Westwood in the early 1970s. But it gets channeled from a very politicized notion of a kind of historic right to housing to a very individual notion. I can find a place for select middle-class folks of color. The Rome for Fair Housing Act is eventually restored by the Supreme Court, which says, indeed, the 14th Amendment does apply to California. But, this notion, it's really Reagan that captures it. Reagan said, I despise bigotry. I mean, that's the worst person in the world is a bigot. And, of course, Californians have every right to decide what they want to do with their property. And that notion of kind of disavowal, of embracing an ideal but disavowing it in practice, I think, kind of continues to set the stage. Just want to just show this. This is a slide that shows, produced by folks at USC, I'll just let it run a couple of times. It shows, so the darker red shows concentrations of African Americans in across LA County. The aqua line there is the city limits of LA. So you can see by decade. So in the 1940s, the first concentration when covenants officially forced people into like kind of the South LA, it spreads out to Watts. But even after the kind of formal lifting of these barriers, the informal practice are as kind of effective. And there's similar maps on their website that show the kind of concentration of Mexican Americans. One more time there. Okay, so I want to say kind of, culturally how accepted it became. LA and the Postwar area would develop along these dramatic lines. The last thing is, there are some contemporary things of this. Not only, what happened then historically is people that in the outlying suburbs, where people of color tended to be excluded, could accumulate some equity in their homes, whereas people in the central city couldn't. So that during the housing boom, the first people that were so desperate for loans were much more likely to fall victim to predatory lending. But once those loans were kind of tried out on low-income communities of color, they spread dramatically, such that even kind of middle-class white suburban communities started relying on them. And I think that's part of what explains why California has such a central role, and why California lending companies were so central in the national mortgage crisis, was this history of dramatic inequalities and disparities in access to homes. Do I have about 10 more minutes? Okay. All right, I want to just do 2 more quick examples then, and then I'll wrap up. In the 1970s, once housing had such kind of dramatic patterns of segregation, schools inevitably would be segregated as well, because schools were typically structured in kind of neighborhood areas. And what happened was civil rights groups saying, you're not even meeting separate but equal. You have cases where the newer schools built in the suburban areas have all the resources, the best teachers, et cetera. The families who are left behind have much less access to a high-quality education, and this violates the Equal Protection Clause of the state constitution. So the courts begin implementing desegregation orders. And two efforts in the 1970s are attempted to tell the courts, you can't tell us that we have to desegregate our schools. And I just want to compare them quickly. The first in 1972 is by actually a pretty conservative guy from Southgate, Floyd Wakefield. And he says desegregation in all its stripes is bad. You can't tell us what to do with students. These are my rights. Kind of similar to Prop 14, over my dead body, are you going to force integration on us? In 1970, and he was a self-identified Republican conservative. In 1979, a Democrat, a liberal Democrat, said that's actually not the way to do it. And he instead rewrote the Equal Protection Clause of the state constitution. And it said that you can't apply equal protection unless you can prove intentional patterns of discrimination, which comported very well with the notion that if it happens to be that I live in a segregated area and my kid goes to a segregated school, unless you can prove that I intentionally did that and sought to disenfranchise someone else, you can't talk to me about equal protection. Now this is a mailer from the Wakefield version of it. And you can see it's this kind of vulnerable, innocent girl who asks her mother, he was proposing to do a commercial like this. Mommy, why do I have to get on that bus? The government is forcing you to. Mommy, why is the government forcing us to go so far away to school? Why is that government so mean to us? And you can see here political whiteness, right? That shows who the us is that the government is targeting. Aren't we people too? But ultimately, this isn't sustained. The state courts say you can't just put a blanket prohibition on integration, right? That's not going to be that's not legally defensible, and ultimately the court overturns the measure, even though it passes by the electorate. In 1979, this Democrat, Alan Robbins, says this is not the way to do it. He says we love all kids, right? But the problem is just these bus rides. It's just not fair to push people around. Right? But it's taken with this very kind of progressive, forward-thinking, all of us have to gather together. Right? So a very dramatic way, a difference in the way it's framed. And again, ultimately, the state court rules the 1972 ban unconstitutional. But 79, it goes to the US Supreme Court, and they say it's perfectly legitimate. And California schools become the first where students who were in desegregated classrooms as a result of court order move back to segregated classrooms. And the point I want to just make here is that it's through liberal ideas that this is accomplished. And so it's interesting then, in the 70s, there's all these dramatic conflicts about school desegregation, burning of buses in Michigan, dramatic violence in Boston. And in California, it's we love all kids. Right? They absolutely accomplish the same goals. And today we have among the most segregated schools in urban areas. And I find it striking that in 1968, Chicano students, 20,000 students walked out of LA schools to protest their right to a fair education, and they were generally dismissed. And now in 2009 and 2010, you have UC students themselves making the exact same demands. Right? And kind of what that means about democracy's ability to incorporate critiques. Just to finish up then, in the 1980s, there were English-only measures. These were fairly ideological and dogmatic immigration restrictionists who said, nobody really cares about making English the official language. What can we do? And they said, what we'll do, there's no popular movement to do it, it doesn't have any dramatic impact on people's lives. We'll qualify a ballot measure in California. That'll popularize it. And they put two measures on the ballot to do the same thing, that immigrants need to learn English, this will empower them, and they both passed. And then finally we get to the 1990s, Proposition 187. People often remember Proposition 187 to support it at that time, Republican Governor Pete Wilson. He had this really effective ad, They Keep Coming, that showed people coming across the border. But Wilson himself was actually he was historically a very, very moderate figure around immigration. But part of what he realized is, when he could build his re-election bid around immigration, is that even his opponents by that time, so kind of beaten down by all these earlier losses, were completely unwilling to assert any rights to the contrary. So, for example, this is the Ballot argument in favor of Proposition 187. While our own citizens and legal residents go wanting, those who choose to enter our country illegally get royal treatment at the expense of the California taxpayer. And again, you can see hints of kind of political whiteness lurking. Right. And again, this notion of claiming a majority status. The Save Our State coalition is comprised of Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, all races and colors and creeds with the same common denominator. We are American by birth or naturalization. So that notion 40 years ago that Americanism could help defeat discrimination and segregation is actually continue to incorporate to say, indeed, we can pass this dramatically restrictive measure in the name of Americanism, in the name of being fair. But what stands out even more is that the coalition of groups that comes together to defeat Proposition 187 says it will be impossible to make any arguments that violate people's expectations, the expectations of political whiteness. So what do they say in their ballot argument? Something must be done to stop the flow of illegal immigrants coming across the border. Unfortunately, Proposition 187 doesn't do a thing to beef up enforcement. It doesn't crack down on employers. So indeed, all those expectations, immigrants themselves represent the deep problem in California society. This is just not the way to go after them. An estimated 40,000 kids would be kicked out of school, but Proposition 187 won't result in their deportation. Just what we need, 40,000 kids hanging out on street corners. We all know what happens to kids who don't finish school. And they would make all of these references. All those folks who are cooking your food, if you deny them health care, they're going to start carrying diseases. So again, all the same stigmatizing portrayals of immigrants that the restrictionists pose, they embrace and endorse because of these expectations of political whiteness. And indeed then, when immigrants themselves take to the streets and say, it seems to me that if I'm good enough to cook food and work in people's houses, this notion that I should be civically dead is wrong. And the Proposition 187 opponents are furious. They say, we do not want to put brown people in front of this movement. And the measure passes by a large margin. So it reminds us then that by the 90s how powerful political whiteness has become. And it was certainly true in Proposition 209 around affirmative action and around militia with children. Okay, so just to wrap up then, to think again about this connection between racial subordination and direct democracy, what is their connection? And I've argued that we need this concept of political whiteness to think through this, the kinds of subjectivities that are produced. So for example, in 1946, we heard about our rights of association, our rights to work with who we want. In 1964, our property rights. Around school desegregation, our schools, our kids, our language, our common heritage, our borders, our rights to fairness. And that invocation of the our there, while it makes no reference to race, is predicated on what I call political whiteness. That's the our we're referring to. And then just to conclude, again, I want to ask this question, what is the political subjectivity produced by democratic practices, the we of direct democracy? What kinds of racial subject has it produced? It's produced the racial subject of a person that says, I absolutely believe in fairness, I'm absolutely against bigotry, and I'm absolutely opposed to affirmative action programs. And to try to think through this concept of political whiteness, a political subjectivity, or gaze on politics framed by these expectations of others. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, I think that's entirely true. I'm certainly not saying it's the exclusive province of political whiteness. I think you can find it in kind of many, many avenues of public deliberation and policymaking. But I think it operates in this powerful way because it legitimates a kind of populist, provides a kind of populist warrant to the claims that are being made. So for example, in partisan politics, there's some recognition that you yourself are partisan, right? That you're representing some portion. In direct democracy, implicitly, you're representing the voice of the people, of the reasonable, good, fair-minded people, and it's your opponents who are themselves partisan. So I think it amplifies the way that a certain perspective comes to be elevated to the perspective of the people. so that's why I think, and I guess I should be clear, I'm not saying that those elements don't exist in other forms, but I'm saying they operate powerfully here, and that's why we need to pay attention to it.
Thank you so much for this incredible talk. And I see a lot of resonances of this with my own work on democracy in India, and the way in which procedural democracy is used to support substantive democracy. And so much of what you talked about was about how the ballot is used, both sides, in order to support substantive democracy. And I'm thinking, if you can say a little more about what you think are the conditions in which democracy can be supported without recourse to actually the ballot. So I'm thinking, for instance, the case of the debate around the mosque in New York. The idea that, of course, they have the right, but really this is about sentiments. This is about what Americans are. This is about what we think. And so rights is one thing. So this danger, what I think about is consensus that need not take recourse to procedures, that need not use the ballot, but create a sort of public consensus that can be deeply subversive. So do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I should be very clear. These forms of populism certainly exist in many, many arenas other than the ballot measure, right? And, you know, as a kind of counterfactual, we could say California could unfold in similar ways absent the ballot. I mean, I'm just, in terms of the ballot, particularly interested in the way, just to take an example, in the early 1990s, very few Californians were talking about immigration. People were talking about job loss. Some people were talking about crime in schools. People were ambivalent about immigration. But it's through a ballot measure that this notion of a consensus that frames immigration as a problem, that something must be done, that the public stands unambivalently opposed to it, gets produced. So, I mean, in the 1994 contract with America, there's not a single mention of immigration and not a single mention of affirmative action. So it's not just, you know, giving pre-existing expression to a fully formed argument. Right? Even the conservatives in the 60s said, how are we going to make an argument to the electorate that it's legally defensible to discriminate by race at a time when freedom fighters are dying in the South? So they had to think about how to produce that consensus. So that's part of what I'm arguing there. And then to that point, I mean, I absolutely think that's, I mean, even, you know, Lewis Hartz in the 1950s talked about this kind of, that the legitimacy of liberalism is produced because the argument is it's detached from any social location. It's an abstract, universal gaze on politics. I'm not saying as a wealthy man, I declare that only I have the right to something. But it's in that very disavowal of a specific location that you're able to, in fact, legitimate policies that, as you know, also point out, are kind of deeply subversive. So it's actually liberal ideas and that disavowal of privilege and attachment that I see as kind of animating all of this. It's not illiberalism.
Matthew.
This is in reference to the slide that had the growth of African American and Latino communities. In Northwest Pasadena, there's an area of Altadena that's still referred to as Afro-Dena because it's such a high population of African Americans. And I was always told, being educated in the area, that this was because they chose as a race to come together as a middle class and live there. Is it in fact because that is the only area where there was housing that was sold to African Americans during the time that it was?
Yeah, I mean, you know, and there can be, both can be true. You can imagine an era when you're watching people's houses get, you know, stones thrown into them, that you might want to find a place. But it's also absolutely true. I mean, realtors at the time, there's some truth to their notion. We are not just against selling houses, right? They say, we'll sell houses to anyone. But they exactly want to market and say, when, for example, black, you know, kind of more middle-income earners are ready to move outside the central area, we'll then figure out a portion of Pasadena that will market in that way. So that's absolutely the case, and it's certainly the case with Latinos in places like Montebello. So I think both are true, but it's not simply a colorblind market that individual home seekers themselves are making those kinds of decisions on. And in fact, when these objections are first brought to the realtors, they say, that's fine, we are happy to develop any kind of other housing, you know, for other folks. But race for them still played the central role in being able to distinguish kind of which markets are available to them.
Okay. Geographically, I'd like to add that is the area that's closest to the mountains and farthest away from any
Yeah, I mean, that's criticism.
Father, go ahead.
So I'm trying to phrase this question, trying to figure out the wording, but obviously you've shown in your presentation that the majority of these ballot initiatives have been predicated by this political whiteness that you've shown. I'm really curious about what the conditions would be for a ballot initiative, especially as we have communities that not untraditionally represented communities being empowered in recent years. What would be the conditions for a ballot initiative to come forward that would not be so predicated by this political whiteness? As we have national organizing around immigration, sensible immigration policy and whatnot, what would you see as the sea change for this?
Yeah. That's a really wonderful question, because part of the argument is these passed at a time when if the white electorate alone approves of something, as they did in all these measures, whatever voters of color do doesn't matter because of the imbalance in the electorate. And then the argument is with kind of new Latinos, for example, were I think 30% of the electorate in this election. Demography is kind of destiny. And I think part of that is true. I don't think you would see the California Republican Party running an ad saying they keep coming and knowing that they would be immune to it, at least in the short term. Historically, we know that whiteness is indeed dramatically flexible politically. It can incorporate, it can adopt. That's always what it does. So I talk in the very end about a kind of multiracial political whiteness. And one example of this is in 2004, there was a measure to revise 3 strikes. There were stories coming out about people who had stolen a pizza or a book and were getting 25 years, and it's bankrupting the state and it needs to be reformed. And that initiative was, it had financial support, it was 10 points ahead in the polls. Democrats, Jerry Brown, Gray Davis, and Republicans at the 11th hour got together and ran ads scaring the crap out of people, saying this is going to release rapists, felons into the street and into your homes. And in the end, didn't pass. And I would argue that that subjectivity that it's kind of pitched towards, which doesn't have to just include white voters, but that notion of vulnerability, right? That there's people out there trying to get your stuff, and that's what you have to do, is a part of political whiteness. And that demonstrates the ways in which a multiracial political whiteness can, in fact, be formed. And so the measures defeated, the prison system, from my perspective, has run the state budget into the ground, tremendous human harm, and it's been endorsed by a multiracial electorate.
Before you take 2 more questions, let me say, John, hold on to that question, because I think what you want us, it's John, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And what you want us to think about is, are there ways to get out of this trap?
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the nice things about having a symposium format is we're not done thinking about it, right? An initial provocation gets us to start thinking, and it may take time to hold on to that idea and think about it later this afternoon and keep thinking about it over weeks as well. But I hope we'll be coming back to that at the roundtable. I'll take 2, I'm sorry.
Okay, let me just, and I appreciate your clarifying that. Just to, from my perspective, so this was the kind of dramatic march in October of 1994. The consultants, again, who were against 187 were pulling their hair out. But this is actually a rejection of political whiteness. This, people's bodies filling the streets, saying, I refuse to make myself invisible, does say, I don't care what your expectations are, the way parents do. So I think that if we're talking about transformation, it's kind of like this. It's the confrontation of political whiteness. And in the book, I use a lot of kind of James Baldwin writing in the 1960s that says that this fantasy of whiteness, that you can live in a world and be completely invulnerable and have all your expectations resist at the center, is destructive. It's destructive even for people who think of themselves as white. And so I argue that in fact it's confronting political whiteness rather than these approaches which apologize for it.
I think Baldwin's voice is great there. It comes out in a number of places, but I'm thinking particularly of that published conversation with Margaret Mead, where I think he's terrifically articulate in engaging her and trying to get her to see that.
Absolutely.
There's a question there. We'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll take our break, but we will be coming back to these questions, please.
You mentioned something about paying people to gather signatures, which is what you see now.
Yeah.
And in the last couple election cycles, we have seen propositions like Prop 8 that was financed by a handful of very wealthy individuals, and then we saw Prop 23, which was backed by Texas oil companies out of our state. How do you see the role of big money playing into propositions, and how does that all play out with political whiteness?
It's a great and important question. I mean, one thing is that it's actually after direct democracy is adopted in California in 1911, that critique is made 5 years later. All this other money is coming in. And while it's certainly been concentrated recently, it's not in any way a new phenomenon. And the courts have been pretty firm that challenging that is not going to be overturned. So, I mean, just as a kind of practical strategy. I think that's certainly true, but the thing to remember is, I mean, for example, both Proposition 187, Proposition 209 were not bankrolled by big conservatives. They were started by, local activists thinking that there might be some room, and only, I mean, Pitt Wilson actually comes on very late in supporting 187. It's only after he sees they've captured something here, something about political witness, that all the money starts coming in. So at least in this handful of ones that I've looked at, the money actually follows the kind of messy politics on the ground. So I'm not to say that that's not deeply corrosive of notions of democracy and, kind of critical to examine. But at least here, it's not, for many of the initiatives, it's not the big pocket donor kind of brainwashing people there. It's small groups who say, we can figure out a way to, in liberal California, we can get voters to agree to turn public teachers into immigration officers, right? And then the Republican Party says, well, show us how to do it, and we'll write you a check.
I want to ask a follow-up question about money where it's clear the courts are not going to accept restrictions. But I wonder what you say about whether the recent experience where the pro-oil, pro-global warming initiative fails, that transparency helps. That being, I think, to my perception, the campaign against that, because it was able to identify that the money was coming in from oil companies, I think that was crucial for some traction in attacking it.
I think that's right. In terms of, I mean, that's always the key, is kind of removing the notion of populism and widespread support. So that, certainly like tobacco taxes, things around the insurance industry. I think that people have a way to conceptualize the notion of kind of unimpeded corporate power as a way to continue.
And this is why the opposition in the U.S. at the federal level, particularly from the Republicans, to having any kind of transparency rule as a balance to the recent Supreme Court ruling seems to me to be so a crucial place for a future intervention.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. So we have to remember, folks like George Soros, who are doing it on the other side as well. So kind of both sides are participating in it. So yeah, I think it's crucial that it gets us apart.
Last question for a break, please go ahead.
The conservative groups that you said that they often don't talk about race, instead they frame it as freedom. And I've heard that recently with like Rand Paul saying, I would never personally not allow a black person to come into my private store. I would personally never do that, but I constitutionally can tell other people to. I find that really similar. And do you think that with the new Tea Partiers, they're going to actually try to pass similar things like that?
Yeah, so that's a great point, which is, and I think a point in mind there, that none of this is new. It wasn't invented in California. You can see claims like this all over, freedom, property rights, operating in other places. Just on the Tea Party question, I actually don't think that, I think political whiteness absolutely animates it when people say, take back our country, what's happened to our country. I think it's hard, I can't think about that without whiteness. But I don't think I think they know actually not to push things like the Civil Rights Act, which have kind of been incorporated in some ways